Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back. I'm the Muslim metaphysician, and today I'm going to respond to Christian scholar Dr. Andrew Loke. Recently, he responded to one of my videos critiquing his model of the incarnation. I just want to reiterate to you guys, consider hitting the like, subscribe, and share buttons below if you enjoy this video, if you enjoy my content in general, and you wish to see more like it in the future. Now, I'm just going to get you guys up to speed on what has occurred thus far as the timeline goes, for those who are not familiar with what has been happening in the past few weeks. So, a couple months ago, I had a debate with Dr. Joshua Sijuadi on the SE Dawa channel, and it was on the incarnation. Now, in that debate, Dr. Josh represented a modified version of Dr. Andrew Loke's model of the incarnation, known as DPM, or cryptic Christology. So after that video, after that debate that I had with Joshua, I made a separate video on my channel critiquing Loke's model specifically, and I referenced some points that we discussed in the debate as well. Now, recently, Loke obviously has seen and watched my debate. He also has seen and watched my video on his model of the incarnation, and he took it to YouTube. YouTube channel specifically is Intellectual Conservatism. I'll put a link in the description of this video to the video that he actually made responding to my video. And in this video, he was interviewed and attempted to respond to my criticisms of his model. Now, since then, since watching this video by Dr. Loke, I've been in communication with him, and he has agreed to debate me in writing regarding this issue of his model of the incarnation. Now, we will be debating in writing on my newly created website, which is www.themuslimmetaphysician.com. I will also put a link in the description to my website. Now, the details and structure of this debate can be found on my website, and I will place, as I said, a link in the description to the page where we will debate in the comments of that page. Now, I am making this video to explain, as I just went through, the sequence of events that have occurred thus far, as well as to address and respond to some of the points that Dr. Loke made in the last video where he was attempting to respond to my criticisms of his model. I will not be responding to all of Dr. Loke's points exhaustively. The video is literally about 2.5 hours. In the beginning, some of it wasn't actually directed at me, but there were some general preliminary remarks. But a lot of the video was directed at me, at least over an hour. And so because of that, there's no way that I'll be able to respond point by point to his videos. However, I will be offering some brief remarks in regards to his video that should suffice as a springboard to the written debate that will ensue on my website and on my page. Like I said, I want to emphasize that there's no animosity between between Andrew and myself. This is purely an academic dispute. And I appreciate Dr. Loke's scholarship and his willingness to engage with difficult issues in a serious manner. Now, many lay Christians and Muslims alike do not appreciate the importance of the work that Loke and his Christian colleagues undergo, and do not see the need for such philosophical explanations and examination of these key doctrines in the Christian faith that are assumed to be Christian truths. Now, Loke understands the necessity of this work, and this is something I really truly admire about him and his Christian colleagues. On this point, I'm going to play some clips throughout this video of Loke commenting on the situation and the dispute between him and I, and on this point of the necessity and the relevance of responding in the way that Loke is attempting to do in response to my videos. He's going to comment on this, and I'm going to play a clip from him in which he does this. So just give me 1 second to have it set up. Okay, and here it is.
this is an important point I want to emphasize, right? Because as I said before, I want to say it again. I'm not claiming that the cryptic model is the actual model, right? I'm not claiming to have figured out how Jesus is God and human, right? I don't claim to have figured that out, right? But all I need to do is to come up with a possible model, right, to show that there is no contradiction and to show that, well, for all we know, this is how it could have happened, right? And that's all that is required to rebut the charge that the incarnation is incoherent. And rebutting this charge is important because I understand that for many of my Muslim friends, believing in the incarnation is something very difficult for them, right? So I have friends who are Muslims. I love them. I love my Muslim friends, and I know that for Muslims to believe in Jesus as God and human, this is very difficult because they have a lot of obstacles, right? Because to them, it is like a contradiction, right? To them, it is like asking them to believe in a round. It's like asking them to believe in a shapeless square, for example, right? I mean, it's a contradiction, right? There cannot be such a thing, right, as a shapeless square, right? So I understand the difficulties that my friends have, right? I understand how difficult it is, right, for them to believe in the incarnation. And so to help my friends, what we can do is to suggest a possible model, right? And this possible model will be enough to show that there is no contradiction, right? And therefore, we can believe the incarnation, right, on the basis of the historical evidence.
Okay, so that was Dr. Loke commenting on the importance of rebutting the charge of incoherence. So the point of that clip specifically was to show Muslims and Christians alike, hey, look, this is the whole point of this entire discussion that we're talking about. Some things may seem very complicated at times, but the charge of incoherence is a very important charge that Christians should attempt to respond to if they want to engage in academics. If they want to speak of this issue in a very detailed manner and respond to charges of incoherence that I have made, Andrew is admitting that this is an important thing to do. Okay, so that's the first clip that I wanted to play from Dr. Loke. Now I'm going to go to a second clip here in which Dr. Loke explains the difference between the sort of basics of the incarnation and more complicated stuff as we get into it further. Just give me 1 second here.
God loves us, right? Even my child can understand that, right? Even a 5-year-old can understand that Jesus loves me, this I know, right? Or the Bible tells me so, right? So in a sense, there's an aspect of Christianity which is easy to understand, that God loves us, that he has provided salvation for us, and that we can come to Jesus with a childlike faith, right? That we can accept his salvation. So we don't have to study a lot of metaphysics or theology or even read my books first, right, before believing in Jesus, right? I'm not saying that people have to read my books first before believing in Jesus, right? I never said that, right? So people can just come to Jesus with a childlike faith, right? And salvation, right? God's love, right, is easy to understand, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Right? So the essence of the gospel is easy to grasp and understand, right? That dimension of God is easy to understand. However, there is another dimension to God, right? His being, right? And also the metaphysics of the incarnation. Now, those are not easy to understand, right? And
so in that clip, the point of that clip was to show that there's a difference between what Loke calls basically the basics of the doctrine of the incarnation, that Christ, the second person of the Trinity, supposedly was God on earth, God and man, came to this earth to die on the cross for our salvation, for our sins. But then in the second part, he distinguishes that between the metaphysics of the incarnation, how it exactly works. And he says that is a much more complicated subject. And for that, we have books like this, which is The Metaphysics of the Incarnation, published by Oxford Press. I definitely recommend it as an introductory text to anyone who's interested in the subject and really understanding what models of the incarnation are, what they entail, who are the key proponents of these specific models, what are the strengths and weaknesses of these different models. As you see, I mean, I've gone through the book. I've got all of it highlighted here. Well, not all of it, but a good portion of it that I've gone through this text. And so if you want to get into what Loke talks about as the more difficult things related to the incarnation, these are the texts that are written on these subjects. Now, I just want to give another quote here that I'm going to play from Loke's video, in which he explains some of the more technical aspect that we're going to get into. Now, just give me 1 second here.
That's all going to be relevant. So, Andrew, I'll let you take it away. Do you need to share your screen again?
No need. Yeah.
All right. Cool.
Okay. So now, before that, I also want to just add one more point, right, to what I said earlier on, right? So what I said was that believing in Jesus can be something very simple, right? A childlike faith, even a child can believe, right? Nevertheless, different people wrestle with different questions, right? So, for example, someone like Jake, right, our Muslim friend, right, he would have some very difficult questions concerning the incarnation, right? So, for people like that who have thought a lot and who have a lot of questions, a lot of doubts, right, it'll be helpful, right, to try to remove them, right? And so we have to give more complicated answers, right? We have to give, and the cryptic model, right, is one way, right, to try to help them to remove the obstacle, right, for them to believe in Jesus, right? And so, I hope this clarification helps, right? So what I'm trying to say is that we need to think about the needs of the audience, right? The needs of people. What do they need to? What is it that they're wrestling with, right? What is it that is stopping them from believing in Jesus? And we address them and we help them based on their needs, right, at their level, right? So for the rest of our discussion, I'm going to talk at the level that Jake is talking at, right? So, and it's going to be pretty deep, right? Because he asks a lot of deep questions, a lot of difficult questions about the incarnation. And so I'm going to address those questions. And so from now on, we're going to dive deep into the incarnation, right? I'm going to talk about very complicated things, right? Because he asked very complicated questions, right? So I have to give very complicated answers, right? To answer his questions, right? Otherwise, I'll be dodging his questions, right? Which wouldn't be good, right? And so from now on, right? So I'm going to talk. We're going to go very deep. All right. Okay. So let me.
So that was Loke's comments on the issues that I'm bringing up, and what he was emphasizing, or what I'm trying to emphasize. If you watch what follows in the video, in the beginning he kept it kind of very basic, but then when he started addressing my points and my critiques of his model, it got a bit more complicated. And he's explaining that the reason why it is because I'm asking very deep and complicated questions. Like, as I said, he says, for the rest of our discussion, I'm going to talk at a level which Jake is talking at, and is going to be pretty deep because he asks a lot of deep questions, a lot of very difficult questions about the incarnation. He asks very complicated things, so I'm going to give very complicated answers. Otherwise, I will be dodging his questions, which wouldn't be good. So Loke is at least acknowledging and admitting that what I presented in my video and what I've been presenting on my channel in general, and the debates that I've been having, are at a very high level as far as the discourse on things like the Trinity and the incarnation. And what people need to understand is that much of what we speak about, myself and Andrew Loke, it may be difficult for you guys to understand because you're not familiar with the vocabulary or the words that we're using in relation to the subject. And a lot of those things are explained in books like this, in things like what Andrew's written and what other Christian scholars have written on the subject. So if you're not familiar with these things and you haven't read them, it may very well be difficult for you to follow along and to understand the different moves that we are making in the conversation. So I just want people to understand and appreciate what Dr. Loke is doing and what people like myself are doing, even though we disagree on the outcome of whether or not Loke and some of these other people are successful in defending models of the Trinity and models of the Incarnation. People need to understand that it's at a different level of discourse when you begin to engage these type of things. So these are some of the key things that I wanted to bring up in preparation for the discussion that will ensue on my website as far as the written debate goes. Now, I'm just going to play a couple key points that I'm actually going to engage with, and then I'll have Dr. Loke respond in writing, and then we can kind of take it from there and go back and forth, because as I said, there's so many things that he said in the video that in order for me to stop and play them and respond, this video would become like 3 hours long, and we don't want to make it that long. So I'm just going to play a clip here in which he speaks about a concept known as the concrete versus abstractist nature view and what that distinction actually is. Just give me 1 second to get it up here. 21. Okay.
I hold to the concrete nature view is not because it's more theological. It's not because it's more theologically orthodox. As I said earlier on, nothing of real metaphysical significance rests on the distinction between concrete or abstract nature view, right? It's just a matter of semantics, right? But
so what Loke is talking about there, he's actually explaining there's something known as the concrete nature view and the abstract nature view. Now, this refers to natures which Christ is said to be one person with two complete natures. He has a truly and fully divine nature and also a human nature. And so the question, which you can find in the literature in texts like this, in the introduction, Jonathan Hill actually goes through some of these distinctions where he explains concretist and abstractist view, concretism and abstractism. So he actually explains what the differences are between those things, and you can go in and read those things. Now, different proponents of different models typically take a view. You're either an abstractist or a concretist. Now, Loke seems to have a very unique view in terms of the contemporary literature on the subjects, even amongst his Christian peers. He takes the view, in which I played in a quote, that he doesn't think there is a significant metaphysical difference between the abstract and concrete nature views. And this is what I'm disputing. Now, he says it's just a matter of semantics, and why this is a very important point. The reason it's a very important point, because if you go back and you look at my criticisms of Loke's model and my response to Dr. Joshua, and he actually agrees with me on this point about Dr. Joshua actually agreed with me on my criticism of Loke's model, that Loke's model seems to be internally inconsistent because the model that he represents seems to portray Christ as having an abstract human nature, and yet he calls it a concrete human nature, and that's where there's an internal inconsistency. Now, Loke is disagreeing with that. He still prefers to call his model a concrete nature view, and he says in this clip that not only is he calling it a concrete nature view, he thinks that there's no metaphysical significant difference between an abstract nature view and a concrete nature view. On the other hand, he says it's just a matter of semantics. There is no significant metaphysical difference. Now, Dr. Joshua, in our debate, he disagrees with Loke and he agrees with my criticism. So what he did is he actually took Loke's model. He agrees with the basic fundamental structure, but he said, look, Jake, you're right. Loke's model and others who have criticized Loke on this point, like James Arcady and several others, Joshua R. Farris, who I'm going to quote in a minute, Oliver D. Crisp. Most people, if not all, seem to disagree with Loke and are saying, hey, we like your model, but we think your model actually portrays Christ as having an abstract human nature and not a concrete one. So you should simply just call it concrete. Now, Loke seems to not want to do this, and we're going to go into more detail, hopefully, in the future as to why that actually is the case. Hopefully, he can explain it to us in more detail. But as I was saying, Dr. Joshua agrees with this criticism from people like Farris and Crisp and Arcady and myself. And so what he does is he takes Loke's fundamental structure, accepts it, but then he calls it simply an abstract view. He doesn't call it a concrete nature view. Now, the problem with that is as I mentioned in the debate, is that it seems to mean that Christ had an abstract human nature and an abstract human soul, whereas for us, we, and Dr. Joshua admitted this, you can also find Swinburne admitting this, which I've quoted previously in some of his papers on this, is that we typically understand that the human soul is a concrete particular and not just an abstract set of properties. And so the problem for that is that if Christ was like us in all things apart from sin, and he had an abstract human soul, but yet we have a concrete human soul, that seems to be a fundamental difference, and that's a problem on Josh's view. Now, Josh obviously tries to argue that, and we can speak about that in more detail in the future, where he attempts to respond to that objection. But he does fundamentally agree with me that Loke's model seems to be internally inconsistent because he's calling it concrete on the one hand, but it seems to be portrayed as referring to an actual abstract human nature view. Now, I just want to read a brief quote from Joshua R. Farris's paper, which is called Loke on the Abstract / Concretist Christological Distinction. He says, a semantic problem or a metaphysical problem. So there was a paper by another Christian who specifically wrote on this topic. And he says, and I quote, which Loke also quotes this in his response to Farris, Loke appears to be standing alone in his understanding of the abstractist concretist distinction. And what he means by that, and what I agree with Farris, is that Loke seems to be standing alone on the idea that the difference between an abstract nature and a concretist nature is merely a semantic distinction and not a significant metaphysical distinction. Farris is criticizing that and saying Loke seems to be standing alone even amongst contemporary Christian analytic philosophers on this issue, and I would agree. So not that that's a proof in and of itself, but it should give us pause for concern as to why Loke seems to be standing alone on this issue and saying it's merely a semantic difference and not a metaphysical difference. Now, I'm also going to play another clip that is related to this issue, which is about Christ's human soul. And that was also from the video. Give me 1 second here. So that is right here.
Divine and truly human. It has a complete, concrete. He has a divine aspect which is complete in his divine properties, and a human aspect which is also complete in his human properties, and therefore he is completely human and completely divine. Right? And therefore, in this sense, Christ had a human soul, right? Because his quote and unquote soul, his so-called human soul, was actually a distinct and concrete aspect of the soul of Christ. And this
it's not the clip I wanted here. Give me 1 second to get this up here.
Apart from Christ, rather is an aspect, right, of his of Christ's soul, right? So it cannot exist apart from Christ, right? So it's an aspect of Christ's soul. And Therefore, Christ has a human soul, Christ has a divine soul, but Christ did not have two souls, right? Christ only had one soul, right? Because his one soul has two distinct aspects, right? And we can.
So that is important because in this clip, he literally says, Christ has a human soul and Christ had a divine soul. Human soul and a divine soul. But Christ did not have two souls. He only had one soul because his one soul had two distinct aspects. Now, this seems to be either a contradiction or Loke is equivocating on the term soul because he says that Christ had a human soul, that's one soul. Christ had a divine soul, that's two souls. But then he says Christ did not have two souls. He only had one soul because his one soul had two distinct aspects. So that means if he's using the word soul twice and then saying Christ didn't have two souls, he had only one, then in this explanation, he has to be, I'm giving him for the sake of, for benefit of this discussion, he has to be equivocating on the term soul because it would seem to logically follow from that Christ actually had two souls. Now, reason why this is important, and I think it points out a fundamental problem when we're talking about the distinction between the abstract and concretist view, is that if Christ did take up a concrete particular human soul, then and he was a divine soul prior to the incarnation, then 1 + 1 would equal 2, and it would seem to logically follow that Christ had two souls. But Loke wants to avoid that on pains of Nestorianism or the heresy that Christ was two persons. And so because of that, he has to equivocate on the term soul and say that Christ did have a human soul, but he was only actually one soul. He didn't have two. And so this is an issue. Now, Loke, I know, is going to have a response to this. And I just want to be clear once again to you guys that I'm not going to be able to go into much detail and explaining all of these things in detail. This is just a response that I'm offering to some of the points that Loke has made in his video in response to myself. Now, one of the other key sticking points between Loke and myself is in regards to passages like Matthew 24:36 and Mark 13:32, where it says that the Son doesn't know the hour, and that's the common English translation that we'll see. Now, we see that Dr. Loke has to interpret it under his model as not know, but not aware of. And he criticizes me because he thinks that I'm putting too much emphasis on the English and that the word oidon, and forgive me of my Greek translation because I haven't studied Greek in this manner, that the word translated oidon as knowledge in the text should actually be properly understood as aware. And he gives definition for this semantic range and possibility. He also gives text where it clearly means knowledge. For example, where he wants to quote in John, I think it's 16, that Christ supposedly knows all things. So he agrees that it can possibly be translated as knowledge, and many times in the New Testament it actually is. So this is a significant difference for us. Now, the reason why it is important is because on Loke's model, Christ literally does know everything. So for him, he couldn't possibly translate Mark 13:32 or Matthew 24:36 as knowledge. He has to translate it as aware. Now, he calls it DPM because his model is the divine pre-conscious model. He places Christ's divine knowledge of all true propositions into his divine pre-conscious, which is something akin to you know of it, but you're not consciously aware of it. So I'll give you an example. For example, I know that 2 + 2 = 4, but I'm not consciously aware of it every waking moment. It's not on my conscious mind at all times. But I do understand that this distinction is legitimate in the sense that we can know things that we're not consciously aware of, and that's not a problem. But the reason why it's so important for Loke to translate not as knowledge but as awareness in this text is because it would literally be a defeater for his model. So the problem is not necessarily about the word aware that it's possible, but that on Loke's model, he has to say that it's impossible to translate it as know or refer to knowledge, because that would be a defeater of his model. If we understand it in these texts to literally mean that Christ or the Son does not know when the hour is, then that would be a defeater for Loke's model. Because of the fact that on his model, Christ does know everything. He's just not aware of something. So in this passage, Christ literally did know when the hour would occur, but he was just saying that he wasn't consciously aware of it. Now, I think if you actually are honest in reading the text, you will see that the context doesn't actually bear that out. But I don't, as I said, I don't want to make this video too much longer, so I don't want to go into too much detail on this actual issue because we're running at 30 minutes now. Now, once again, I do want to reiterate to you guys what has actually occurred thus far. I explained that Loke has responded to my model. I actually do want to emphasize that I offered to debate Dr. Loke in video, and he does not want to do that, and that's perfectly fine. He wants to address me and debate me in a written format, which I'm happy to do, and I agreed to. But if he ever does change his mind, I would be willing to debate him on video about the specific issue. So yeah, once again, guys, this video was just a brief response to Dr. Loke's response to me. And it was an explanation of what has occurred up until this point and what will happen in the future. Now, I will post this video. And I will send it to Dr. Loke. And the goal is that he will watch the video and then respond in writing to some of the key points that I've brought up until this point. And then we will have a further dialogue in writing on my website, themuslimmetaphysician.com, where we will have a written debate on this topic. So once again, guys, I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Please consider hitting the like, subscribe, and share buttons below if you enjoyed the content on my channel and wish to see more like it in the future. I look forward to seeing you guys in the future, inshallah. Thanks again for watching. Assalamu alaikum.